Welcome back to Fund Your Future with DRS. Well, we've previously talked with State Actuary Matt Smith about how pension plans are funded in Washington. And today we're excited to have him back on the podcast to kind of walk through a simple example of how to measure the health of a pension plan. How do we make sure that we still have money enough to pay everyone's pensions? So, welcome back, Matt.
Thank you. Great to be back.
Matt, so I wanted to start off by just acknowledging that there's a lot of negative news about pensions. Jenny and I have talked about this on other episodes, that there's a sort of doomerism, like doom sells, doom gets clicks. And oftentimes pensions are associated with negative news. But Washington has some of the best funded pensions in the country. We've talked about that with you in the past. We've talked about it with other folks from your office. But we want to spend a little bit of time today talking about a pretty unique situation in the country, in that we also have a pension plan that is significantly overfunded. So I want to give a little bit background for our listeners who might not be totally in the weeds on all things pensions, but there is a retirement plan for law enforcement and firefighters called LEOFF Plan 1. It was originally opened in 1970 and then closed to new enrollment in 1977. And since the early 2000s, the plan has been recognized as being overfunded. In this episode, we're not going to get into too many details about how the plan became overfunded, but Matt, I'm hoping you can just give our listeners like a 1-minute explanation on the background of how we've gotten here with LEOFF Plan 1.
Yeah, happy to. It might be a little bit challenging, but I'll give it my best shot. Yeah, normally I'm a little cautious about using the term overfunded, because we're typically funding ongoing obligations, and maybe you're a little ahead of the curve at one point. Maybe you can dial down contributions a little bit, but it's just this ongoing need, ongoing entity. But in the particular plan you mentioned, LEOFF 1, that's a plan that's been closed to new members for quite some time. We've set aside more than sufficient money to cover all the expected obligations of the plan throughout the rest of its lifetime. Happy to get into maybe some follow-up questions on how we got there. But yeah, I guess the short answer is, the state set aside more money than we thought we would need. Investments have been performing really well. And on a projected basis, the program has significantly more assets than we think it will need to pay all promised benefits.
And I should have just mentioned for context as well that almost everyone in LEOFF Plan 1 is retired already. And I think that will be helpful context as we move forward. There are less than 2 handfuls of people still actively working in the plan. And so we have a pretty good idea of how much we are paying out in retirement benefits every month and every year going forward. And there aren't a lot of new benefits being earned.
It's a great point. And the other thing too, you mentioned, contributions were stopped, ceased to this program in 2000. So I mentioned earlier, like one thing you can do is reduce or turn down contributions. There's been no member employer contributions to this plan for over 20 years. And we're still in the situation that we're in.
So, Matt, kind of walk us through a scenario. So, assuming that DRS keeps paying out the same amount each year and investments don't grow, we've run the numbers and the money would only last about 17 years. But then are there those big concerns about if the money is going to run out?
Yeah, I think this is where, it might be helpful to put a little bit of a simple handle on it, if you will, for folks that, maybe are as close to the numbers, as my office is. That's just looking at the money that we've set aside and the benefit payments, that are currently being paid. We look at this on a fiscal year basis every June 30th. As of June 30th, 2023, our last full audited measurement, the program LEOFF 1 had about $6.8 billion in assets and was paying out about $384 million in annual benefit payments. So one very simple way of looking at it is, how long could we pay at $384 million if it stayed flat and the program didn't earn any additional investment earnings and also didn't lose any investment earnings? That would be just over 17 years. It's a very, very simple way of looking at the sufficiency of the assets. Average age of the population is in their late 70s. And from an actuarial perspective, look at all the payments for all these beneficiaries, probably roughly about 17 years of benefit payments expected for that population on average. So at a very high level, sends I think a very clear message of how well funded that program is. that it has that much in assets, and you could pay that many years of benefits without earning additional dollar of investment earnings.
That's incredible.
That was sort of the no investment earnings and how long could this corpus of assets, if you will, sustain current benefit payments. Another way of looking at it is, what if we earn what we expect on that amount of assets? So if we have just under 6.9 billion in assets, and we earn 7% return on that each year, we won't do that every year, but that's sort of a long-term expectation. That amount of money itself, just the investment returns on the assets, is more than what we need to pay current benefit payments. And that starts to me, that's sort of, for those that might be familiar with this financial concept, that feels a little bit like a financial endowment where you can provide what you want, whatever program it might be. We typically see it in like higher education. You can provide your program solely based on the investment earnings of the fund and not touch the principal at all. LEF One is so well funded, it's really approaching, not just approaching, I think it has become an endowment in terms of a financial concept of how well funded it is.
Yeah, because then I guess the question that I jump to then is, so once all of these left one retirees have passed away, then what happens with all of that extra money?
That is a question I hear quite a bit, and it's a question that the legislature is grappling with, has had some legislative proposals on that very topic. The Select Committee on Pension Policy was tasked by the legislature to study that issue this interim, and opinions vary on this topic. The legislature is looking at potentially merging the plan with other plans. They've also looked at potentially terminating the plan and restating it, making sure that you set aside a sufficient amount of assets, and any assets above that could be used for other purposes. They're complicated proposals. They require legal analysis and a lot of study, but because LEF One has approached this level of funding, one way of looking at it, it's gotten so large, this surplus, that the legislature is definitely interested in seeing how that money could be used, and is well aware, Jenny, of the outcome of, if we have more than what we need for this program, what are we going to do with this money? Can we do anything with this money legally? Do we have to wait until the last person literally receives a benefit from this plan until they pass away before we can do anything with it? These are really important policy questions that the legislature is grappling with. And I'm glad, like our agency working with you and other agencies can inform the legislature on, I think, this very difficult question.
Well, thanks for that. Like you said, it's important to address now and start looking at what are the options. They've never really had this option before.
It's such a good problem to have. Back to my earlier comment about oftentimes really bad news about pensions. This is really kind of amazing news about pensions, at least in Washington. Matt, I want to circle back to your endowment idea and just think about how that would look for other retirement plans in the state. I've heard you say in the past that there are different ways to fund pension plans. And there's the pay-as-you-go model that people think about with Social Security, where basically the money that's coming in is just turning right back around and paying out the benefits. And then there's the model that Washington uses generally for most of our retirement plans, where the money coming in now is invested, and then those contributions and the investment earnings are intended to pay out benefits 20 or 30 years down in the future. Would it be fair to say a model more like LEF One would be, say I start working today as a public employee or as a teacher, and on average, I'm going to work 20 years. The state or the employer could pay in a bunch of money right now, and then we don't have to put in any more money for Seth in this case, and the investment returns over the next 3 decades or 4 decades, however long I'm going to work, would then pay my future retirement benefits. Is that sort of where we got with LEF One, with some extra funding early that allowed us to get to this point?
In a way, and I think I loved your example of sort of the spectrum of funding, if you will. That can make it somewhat easier to understand. I think a lot of us are familiar with that pay-as-you-go approach, like you mentioned, Social Security. Very affordable to the employer or the member, in the sense that, right, you're just making those payments when they're due, but you're also not taking advantage of any investment earnings really, and being able to set aside money that will build and grow. It can offset some of that obligation. your example of perhaps, what if we put like a large lump sum up front? Yeah, that would maximize potentially the returns on that, but could also be very expensive to fund, to put a lump sum in for everyone, day one. The method that we use in most of our plans, the systematic actual funding is really just sort of trying to set aside enough money during someone's career to kind of blend those two approaches. Makes it a little bit more predictable, a little bit more affordable. LEF one really, I think, started out with unfunded liabilities when it was created. The legislature, I think, did a good job of obviously closing that. Tried to do this systematic approach of setting aside money as people were working, but the assumptions ended up being wrong. Inflation came in a lot lower than what we expected. And even with this systematic approach of making the contributions on an annual basis based on what you think you're going to need, still ended up in the program having more assets set aside than what it needed. And hard to make adjustments. I mentioned earlier, the first thing that they did was just shut off contributions. Seemed like a very reasonable thing. It looks like we're ahead of schedule. Let's cease contributions. 20 plus years later, after ceasing the contributions, we're still ahead of schedule. So it wasn't necessarily, a lump sum approach. It was systematic actual funding that ended up being more than what the program needed. And yeah, now we're talking about how do we respond to that now that we're in this situation. It is fascinating to me how we went from significant unfunded liabilities to a program now that looks like it has significant overfunding. We're talking about ways that we might need to make explicit statutory changes to manage it. Quite a turnaround.
So I don't want to throw you too much of a softball here, but not all of our listeners are LEFF Plan 1 members, obviously. And you mentioned about if a pension plan gets a little bit ahead of schedule, it might make sense to reduce the contribution rates. But in our plans 2 and 3, what that might mean is if we get 101% funded, that our contribution rates go from 6% to 5.5%. Maybe we don't need to put in quite as much as we were previously putting in. It doesn't mean if we get to 101% that we're an endowment like LEFF 1. It means we need to keep putting money in the future, but maybe not quite as much as we were previously putting in. Is that a fair explanation?
It's a great explanation. I'm really glad you brought that up because I think that came up in one of our earlier podcasts where, a plan that is overfunded. Does that mean that, like, oh, we don't need to put any more money in it? Not normally. You can think of it maybe as like maybe it's your gas gauge in a car that's just going to keep driving. We're going to keep paying benefits, and we expect to pay benefits for the next generation, the current workers, the next generation. You just keep going. Maybe your tank is full, but you're still going to keep driving, right? So let's not no longer put gas in the tank. That's a really important concept for people as they think about this, especially if like you mentioned, you're in PERS 2, right, or you're in PERS 3. You might hear, in the next few years that plan might have a funded status of 102%. That just means the program is slightly ahead of schedule where it needs to be. We would still expect contributions to continue, but as you mentioned, perhaps contributions can come down a little bit, and we're like ahead of schedule, meaning that perhaps we've funded a little bit of the benefits that people have yet to earn. So dial down the contributions responsibly, see how the program adjusts and adapts. Very different from a plan that's like LEFF 1 that's 100% retired for the most part, right? Almost every one of them, like 7 people, for example, have retired, and you're not really expecting or wanting to take contributions in anymore.
I wanted to mention one last thing because I think people get really worried that the pension funds are going to run out of money. And in this example we've talked about with LEFF 1, that seems very unlikely that if you're just able to live off the investments, it's very unlikely that it would run out of money. But Washington State has had some pension funds that are, Matt, the phrase you used earlier, pay as you go, where there isn't a trust fund associated with them anymore. There isn't a pot of money that's paying out these benefits. There are some really much older retirement plans that were for judges and judicial employees who now the state is actually providing DRS money every budget cycle from the general fund that DRS then turns around and pays to those retirees. It's still an obligation and a contract of the state that have to fulfill. And so those folks are still receiving their pensions, even though you would say that those funds are 0% funded. Is that a fair explanation?
It is. And I think, too, another thing to think about, if that's concerning to folks, I think you have to make sure you put it in the perspective of the state budget. So those are also the plans that you referenced, some of those older closed plans, closed to new members. They don't represent really significant obligations to the state. They're important benefits, obviously, to the beneficiaries of those programs. The state has, every intention of honoring that obligation. But for the pay-as-you-go impact of that is very, very small and does not represent any financial threat to the state. So it's not uncommon for the end of a plan's life, if it's a closed plan, no longer open to new enrollees, at the end of the plan's life, if it does reach a point where there is no longer a trust fund, it'd be a very reasonable outcome for the state to set aside the money it needs on a pay-as-you-go basis. Some might argue that that's preferred over having overfunded, right? Because the overfunded situation, like a left one, can create lots of questions about what do you do, like Jenny's question, right? What do you do with this money? Can you access this money? Should it be used for benefit improvements? Can it be merged with another plan? Can the state terminate the plan, restate it, and use it for other purposes? Those are all very challenging questions, and stakeholders have different opinions about them. So it's a good situation to be in. Rather be in that situation than underfunded. But if you do happen to have an underfunded closed plan that's on a pay-as-you-go basis, if it's a very small obligation relative to the state's book of business, if you will, that's not concerning either.
Yeah, this has been very informative.
It's good in that it's not something a lot of people pay close attention to. And as we talked about, it's oftentimes bad news. And I think Jenny's question about, what happens when a college endowment ends and that there's money left over, what do you do with it? Like those are really unique questions, but they also provide opportunity for people to think about how you might use those funds. So appreciate that you took the time to chat with us about these things, Matt.
That was quite a bit, but I think all very educational and hopefully accessible for folks.
Yeah, appreciate it.
Thank you, Matt.
Take care.
Thanks.
Thanks for listening, and now we'd love to hear from you. What topics would you like to hear about? What questions do you have for us? Send an email to drs.podcasts@drs.wa.gov. That's drspodcasts@drs.wa.gov. The Department of Retirement Systems provides this podcast as a public service, but it's neither a legal interpretation nor a statement of DRS policy. References to any specific product or entity do not constitute an endorsement or recommendation. The views expressed by guests are their own, and their appearance on the program does not imply an endorsement of them or any entity they represent. Views and opinions expressed by DRS employees are those of the employees and do not necessarily reflect the view of DRS or any of its officials.